Going back to making it meaningful and accessible to the student, you can, talk to as many people other than the student as you want to gain as much information. But if that's not what the student actually wants to do, if their voice isn't in that, then the information we're getting is just meaningless at that point. A lot of times in academia, we don't uplift those voices and experiences of, especially those with disabilities. And so bringing them onto like my projects, they have different perspectives. It's like, oh, hey, I wouldn't have thought of things that way. Like, yeah, let's do this research together. Like, you are going to be the researcher with me, and, kind of directing things that way. So trying to do this work, but then bringing in those perspectives.
Hey, welcome to Cooperant Learning. It's another episode. It's February. It's cold. I'm still writing 2025 on my documents, even though it's 2026. Why do I do that, Steve? What's the reason for that? I'm putting you on the spot.
I mean, it's just your behavioral momentum, I do believe. You're just so used to it. You're not paying attention or attending to what you're writing. You need some way to make it more salient, as you're putting that on there that you're doing it.
Okay.
Or you can just try to create a program where it does it all for you so you don't have to pay attention.
What are those called on Word? Jim does it to Dwight whenever he types his name, it changes it to something else.
Oh yeah, it's not a rule, but
a macro, right?
Macros.
Yeah, macro.
I love when people do those and they like make it so like their mom is typing something that says something off the wall, especially in a text. And so that's why does it keep saying water balloon? I'm not saying water balloon.
Hey, and Steve's here. I normally introduce you, Steve, but I just kind of threw you in the mix. So welcome, Steve. Happy birthday, Steve.
Happy birthday. And to all the fellow quadragenarians out there now. I put that out there mostly because Cora, who is listening, I threw that word at her just to see how she handled it, and she did not. She didn't disappoint. It was a great conversation, and so I appreciate that.
Any words of wisdom now that you're the big 4-0?
All I will say is it's very sad that I can no longer make fun of Kyle for being 40, and I'm not, because he's only like 2 months ahead of me, and I was really enjoying that period of time, and so now it's kind of sad. It's like I have no disappointment, no midlife crisis, other than the fact that now I can't rag on Kyle for being 40 when I'm not.
Well, we're just over the hill together, so let's just roll down that hill best we can.
I'm gonna take a sled. We're just going for it.
Sleds are good. Yeah. Actually, sledding hurts a lot more now that I'm 40. Oh man. Hey, before we introduce our guest, Cooperant Learning is a project of Sparks Behavioral Services, where we aren't only an ACE-approved CE provider, but we are also behavior specialists that work across the state of Michigan. Our BCBAs provide behavioral supports in a variety of settings and with a variety of people, including adult foster care homes, residential group homes, family homes, and more. So if you're a BCBA or behavior technician looking for something a little different, give us an email at info@sparksbehavioralservices.com.
And we can guarantee that the functional behavior assessment process and design behavior plans for aberrant behavior is never boring. So
never boring. It's never boring. Nope. Keeps you on your toes. Hey, I'm really, really excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Ricky Price, Assistant Professor of Special Education at Purdue University. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
Why don't you give us a little introduction, who you are and what you're all about?
Yeah, of course. So, like you said, I'm an assistant professor of special education at Purdue University. We also have an ABA master's program that's housed under our SPED program. So I teach amongst both the classes and programs. But so kind of getting into this world, I have a family member who has a disability. So that really got me into the thick of things, especially kind of seeing the struggles that like families go through to make sure their children with disabilities, get a proper education. So I always go back to that because I feel like that was the big bang for where I'm currently at to this day. And so, did a lot of volunteering in different programs, got involved in a lot of stuff just because I wanted to kind of take in all that learning. I originally wanted to be a medical doctor. That obviously did not happen. But part of that was because I was seeing that medical professionals aren't always equipped or trained to work with families and, patients with disabilities. But I went down a different path instead, fell into ABA, like I feel like a lot of people do. I was getting my master's of rehab counseling at the same time. So that's kind of my area of supporting those with disabilities in finding employment. And then worked as a BCBA for a few years, decided that I needed to go back to school just because I love it so much, or I love to, be stressed all the time. And now here I am teaching at a university.
Yeah, I'll say after finishing my doctorate, I immediately thought, I have not stopped school since I was, 5 years old? Do I go get an MBA now? Like, what do I do? Because I don't know how to
Right, right.
not be in school.
I always joke around with my partner. I'm like, do I go to law school now? Is that the next path?
How did you find ABA? Is it just being part of the counseling world, or
Yeah,
was
good
there a
question.
catalyst in that?
So yeah, I was doing this program. I went to Michigan State. That's where I met Cora. And I was in my rehabilitation counseling program, and through that, our like early learning center was like opening up a brand new ABA center for early childhood, and so needed a job. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, this is great. That I kind of learned about the field, and they were starting a new master's program. And so I was like, well, why not? I'm already doing one, might as well do two at the same time. Easy. But my advisor that I had, she also focuses on like more of an adult population. And so I worked with her as I was kind of going through that program. So it was cool to take, the science and apply it to like an older population, which I don't feel, at least I was never trained to do that. And I know a lot of people aren't. So that was cool. And I was able to meld those two kind of backgrounds together. So that's how I kind of fell into it, was already at the university. But learning all of it, I was like, oh, this makes so much sense, especially when you mix it with, my other background.
We are mainly working in adult foster care homes and things like that, and it's very fun kind of walking through conferences and things like that and talking to other professionals, and
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of explaining what we do, and like, oh, like is that a thing? And it's not
Mm-hmm.
unheard of, but it's certainly not the norm. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a cool niche for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I like there are conferences that I go to, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm presenting on work, and nobody shows up to my sessions. I'm like, do I need to market this differently? Because it applies
Just
to
Right,
everybody.
right,
just put
right.
ethics in the title, even if you're not doing ethics
True.
CEUs, they'll show up.
That's a super ethical thing to do.
Right, right.
Mask it as ethics. We are not condoning that.
No, it's always refreshing. Also, like so many in our field come from kind of a pure. I was interested because of a family member, a friend, and it's always refreshing to hear because I feel such a horrible person because I'm like, oh, I took one class and fell in love with like the science. I'm like, yeah, I guess I should help people too while I'm along my way. So it's nice to hear people coming from the other side a little bit.
Hey, we need both. We need both.
Well, I definitely want to chat about just your interest in transitioning from school to post-secondary into gainful employment. I thought maybe a good place to start with that conversation, you tell me, but would be with IDEA and kind of talking about what IDEA says about transitions, transition assessments, and kind of like the legality behind it, and then what those transition assessments actually look like.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think it's a great place to start. And that's kind of how I frame a lot of, work that I'm doing kind of with that, because we do have legislative intent for it. So anyway, I'll back up. So as you said, I focus on that transition, and I've kind of found this, more nuanced look at the assessments that are used. And that maybe is because of my ABA background, that I'm like, oh, we need to use this data appropriately. And so I've kind of fallen into this hole, but it's interesting to me. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act idea, the most recent authorization in 2004, it specifically states that when a student turns of transition age, federally that's 16. A lot of states start that as early as 14. There are even states that start that as like 11 and 10. And so like at the very least, when a student turns 16 of age and they have a individual education program, there needs to be appropriate measurable goals that are based upon age appropriate transition assessments. And that's the specific language in the law. And it says that's across post-secondary, education and training, so college and university, employment, and then when appropriate, independent living. So there is that like intent, hey, we need to make sure that the services that we're providing is based upon appropriate data. But that's the only language and kind of guidance in the law. And so like it's left up into interpretation, like that it's very vague. What does appropriate mean? What is, all of that. So there are a lot of scholars and organizations in the transition world that have provided and keep providing guidance and training to educators, professionals, whoever's kind of working with this population, of like, how do we interpret this? How do we provide, appropriate assessments? And so the process is, I'm simplifying it, but what is the purpose of providing this assessment? I want to figure out my students' preferences of what they want to do when they get older. Selecting, the right assessments from that, making sure that it's accessible to those students. So, if we're working with someone who isn't able to communicate in a back and forth interview, we shouldn't be only providing an interview assessment, because then you're going to get data from, you might interview their caregivers or their family members, other teachers that worked with them, and not really involving the students. So making sure that's accessible, and then, using that data to inform those practices that are kind of being put forth. But what I'm finding, and, when I'm talking to people, is that there's still just there's a mishap somewhere happening of like providing these assessments. And so I think we just need constantly more guidance and support. And that's kind of where my work comes into play, because I I believe that we don't know fully enough from like an educator standpoint, like why is this not working?
Mm.
And so like wanting to figure that out so that we can either develop a new assessment if that's the need, more training, what have you in those cases.
And what, in your opinion, is, or maybe based on data, even or in your work, is missing from those assessments? Like, is it an issue specific to more like significant cognitive disabilities, or is it across the board? Like we're missing something, or where are they going wrong in your?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think there's many things. So like that process that I explained of just like, providing assessment, very general, obviously. It should be individualistic. And so there is research out there that, for those with more extensive support needs, we do need to do a little bit more work. We can't just have this blanket assessment process. So like, again, going back to making it meaningful and accessible to the student, you can, talk to as many people other than the student as you want to gain as much information. But if that's not what the student actually wants to do, if their voice isn't in that, then, the information we're getting is just meaningless at that point. And so there is like a different process, but I think the biggest kind of gap in this is we just have a lack of training our future, educators, and I would say like other professionals too within this transition world, of like how to use and select these assessments appropriately. So like that's a big piece that I'm finding. And then also with that is I've talked to some, school administrators and even, special ed teachers that are kind of new in their job. And their school districts are like, hey, we use the transition planning inventory with all of our students. But it doesn't work for all of our students. And so like they have to do that because it's mandated by their district. But is that just checking a box versus, using something that's useful? But then if there's no training that the teachers have to kind of pull from, they don't know what is useful. And then, what are the goals that are made? What are the services? Are they even in line with best, practice, appropriate, you name it?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a variety of assessments, but what you're saying is some teachers may be required by their district to only do one, almost like a, hate to say cookie cutter, but almost like a kind of like a one size fits all, but they're finding one size doesn't necessarily fit all.
Yeah, yeah. And, teachers, obviously, you can do more assessments on top of that, but, their caseloads and they have so much work going on too. So that is a lot of work if you don't know what's going on, of like, hey, where am I going to pull this stuff from? And so there is trust that maybe they, rely on their administrators or those who should have a little bit more knowledge. But again, I think that breakdown, at least what I see, is coming from higher ed. Like we're not doing a good job training any of these people. So like, it's not their fault. because they
Yeah.
don't know any better. We're not doing a good enough job in that regard.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And the one article that you sent me, and we'll include all these in the show notes too, was really interesting because it was talking about how uh, they're interview informed or they're indirect. You know, there's questionnaires and things like that. My coffee maker's going off. Can you guys hear that? Yeah. Why don't
It's
we wait just a second?
You're good. You're good.
It's gonna be
It's
done
making me
here.
want some more coffee.
Every like 30 minutes it does a thing. Okay. Transition assessment. So they're mainly indirect, and with that one study that you sent me, and I forget now who it was from, but there was it was basically showing how what might be important to teachers or what teachers assess are the most important needs for one student might be very different, like skewed differently than what the parents assess. And I found that was really interesting because if you only utilize one informant, one, we already know kind of the downfalls of indirect assessment anyways.
Mhm.
Two, if there's only one informant kind of making those calls um, and making really important decisions going forward based on that. I just found that really interesting how kind of that works. I wasn't really cued into what that world is when those conversations start happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched upon a few different things. So, um, in this, and I would say like any type of like assessment, it doesn't have to be just transition. But you can like categorize them into like these more, indirect, informal, maybe assessments that are maybe a little bit easier to use because they require less training. Maybe they're free online to get, things of that nature. And then you have the more formal, like, here's the commercially available tool that, like, your district is going to buy or what have you, might need additional training. And so, again, I think I always go back to that legislation because there's not clear guidance. It's just we need to be appropriate. And so it's like, all right, well, what category do I pick from? And I think a lot is defaulting to, oh, we need these formal assessments. They have all this, reliability data. They're shown to like, improve outcomes or like be associated with that. But then if we're looking at a population of those with more extensive support needs, some of the research is actually saying that we should be using more informal assessments because the data that we're gaining from them is more useful. And I think that relates back to a formal interview. We're not going to be able to do that with someone who's not able to communicate that way. And so like how much modification and adaptation of an assessment do we do until it doesn't measure what it's supposed to measure anymore? So I think that like piece too, but again, we don't, that education of like, how do we tell people and like administrators or districts that like, hey, this isn't like a one size fits all. But I think also, I mean, there's so many factors that kind of go into like impacting this, but family expectations also. Yeah, I have interviewed
Sure.
teachers before some previous studies that the parents didn't see that direction for their child per se, and so they were less concerned with like doing those assessments and like working on those skills.
Mm.
But then the school, we have to provide that legally. So then there's this disconnect, but I think that's support for caregivers and families as well. Like, at what point are we saying, hey, we got to prepare your child for life after high school? Waiting until they're 18 is too late, in my opinion. And then, maybe that's where some of this disconnect is happening too.
Yeah. So in my experience, consulting in schools usually has more to do with IEP meetings, talking about behavioral goals, that sort of thing. And I mean, it obviously can't have too general of a statement. It's not across the board, but a lot of times it does seem performative. This is, because we have to check this box, the government says we have to do this. Everybody knows what we're really going to do, sort of thing.
Mhm.
Do you think because of the way the rules are written, and you mentioned age appropriateness, and I know there's kind of
Mhm.
that fight between skill appropriate versus age appropriate. Should we have someone in the classroom based on their age or based on what they're like, where they should be and what should they be learning on their educational journey? Do you think some of this is just very much we're going to do this form, this set form or a set assessment just so we don't violate any of those laws along the way rather than knowing that something else may be more effective?
Yeah, I think that it is a lot of checking boxes and almost, like you said, kind of performative, but I don't know if that's like intentional or if that's just how this system kind of is run at this point. Um, I mean, the reason that I went to go get a doctorate in special education, I've never been a special ed teacher, but I was like, we should have interdisciplinary collaboration. I want to learn a lot. So I'm still kind of learning about the world too, but I see things differently just because of my background. But, conversations that I've been in with administrators or special ed teachers, I mean, there are some districts that there's a whole different case like manager that, writes the IEPs for students, but they aren't giving the assessments. They've never met the student in person. And so I think it's just the way that the systems are set up is that we are just trying to be compliant. So like we're following the legislation, but then at what like cost is that like giving us? Is that the
Yeah.
reason why we see a lot of these disparities post high school? Because we're not investing in it. We're just, trying to be compliant.
Yeah, I kind of almost see it as, hopefully at least, and this may be trying to look to the positive side, kind of analogous to what we see with working with insurances in autism centers, where it is, we have to have these goals that we can meet. So we show we're making progress towards these goals, even though they may not be our specific most important goals. And then we'll do those, meet those, but then work on the things we think are really important that may take more time, or we may have more trouble getting or meeting those objectives. Kind of the same
Mm-hmm.
thing, like, hopefully at least the educators are doing something to actually help the person, even though the IEP or the transition goal might just be, we're just putting in the information we need to check this box. But without
Mm-hmm.
doing what you're talking about, which I think is admirable, is trying to figure out how can we do both, combine it. So now we're actually
Mm-hmm.
working towards something, and it's not, just this form we're putting out there to show, see, yep, we're doing it. Because I usually get called in when there's a severe behavior issue to those
Mm-hmm.
IEPs. And it's very much like, nope, we're not making progress on anything else. And so we're just putting things in there so we can check those boxes. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
only seeing that negative side as I'm
Yeah.
doing it.
Yeah, and I think too with that, like I mean, I would think things have gotten better over the years, but like I think this transition to adulthood is such a scary time for parents especially that, there's so many other things that like, okay, we're worried about like working on and wanting to hit. And so maybe some of these quote unquote transition goals where the assessments come into play, it kind of happens like last of like, oh crap, like we're about to be out of the school. We gotta start now, but it's like a little like how can we start this earlier so that we're not kind of scrambling at late. And yeah, I think it's this top down approach. We just need, I always keep coming back because I feel like being on the other side now of like education and in academia, I'm just like we're not doing a great job to prepare any of these people. So like I'm not really putting at faults of any of them. And yeah, I talk to a lot of teachers that they are trying to like do extra work, as well as being compliant, but like that adds a lot onto them as well. Why can't we be compliant by doing like the appropriate things?
Yeah, I can't even imagine as a parent with someone, with special needs, and that idea of that transition. And I can see the both sides. Either you're thinking, you know what, they're just going to be staying with me and nothing's going to change except for what school availability is. Or the other side, what are these next steps? And like, if I'm losing control of some of this and I'm not going to be able to oversee the care
Hmm.
the way I want to. And just, as I have young children, but thinking back to my parents, and their biggest concern was, oh no, now he can be charged as an adult. You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
it's just, I can't even imagine that other side.
Yeah, yeah. And I've done a little bit of work with like families and stuff as well, but and then also, coming from that perspective, very different, but like I see things. Uh, wow, I just lost my train of thought where I go. Oh, I feel well, focusing on work, I think there's sometimes maybe this expectation, there are other things that we should address first for independent living and what have you. Like, some individuals' disabilities due to the benefits that they get, there's a restriction on how many hours you can work and how much money you can make. And so, this idea of work that we have in our society of like, oh, this is how we make a living, like you have to work, no longer becomes that purpose. But like, what are the other benefits that work, you know, espouses? Like all of my really great friends are because of the work that I did in the community that I made and that social
Mhm.
connection. And so, I think we also need to support families to look at it a little bit differently of like, all right, it's not just making a paycheck, but it's they're integrated into society and the community, and they have they feel like they might have a purpose if that's what they want to do, making friends and connections, and all of those things are really important, but I don't know if that's thought about as much.
Well, speaking of employment, we know that employment is associated with higher rates of like post-secondary training.
Mhm.
Where do our students with exceptional needs fall into that? Are they getting that post-secondary training? Does it look different? Are they falling through the cracks? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so I'm trying to delve into that world a little bit more. From my kind of understanding to people focusing on this transition, it's kind of like different camps that you're in of like, oh, I focus on post-secondary education and training, or I'm
Mhm.
just employment, or what other stuff. I mean, everything is interconnected, like you just said. We do have information that says those who are a part of these post-secondary training college university programs, they have better employment outcomes. But there's also data that says that these students are less likely to enroll in these programs at like a significant lower rate than their non-disabled peers. And so that's also an area like, how do we provide more support for that transition, and what that university program or college program looks like? What are those resources so that we can support? Because I think I'm kind of just thinking out loud at this point, but until you're in school until 22, or Michigan 26, some states, is are we working on still all of the skills to be independent, or like now is that being left to these post-secondary training programs, which is fine, but then if we have a large amount of people that are not going into those, then what happens to them at that point? And so yeah, I definitely see that as a piece. Everything is interconnected, and so I don't think we can only look at like one variable, for lack of better.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Hey, we have a question from our audience. Cora says, I think it's up there. How do you get people/stakeholders to invest in it? Cora, I assume you mean the transition process. Is that what you're?
I yeah, I took that to mean kind of the interest, the time, the effort, the care at all for that. How do you get people to care and want to make a change that's for the better?
Mm. Um, Gosh, my mind goes in so many different directions to answer that. So definitely rein me in if I'm going rambling too much.
Oh, you're fine.
Um,
Do it.
but gosh, I don't know where it breaks down, but you can look at it different ways. We need to, get caregivers and families invested. And I mean, a family that has a child and, first time disability, like there's a lot that obviously goes on. The last thing that they're probably worrying about is, 18 years down the road, what's going to happen. So like to support them, we also need, these educators or professionals to like invest in it too. I think that all goes back to these training programs. Based upon just my experience and some of the stuff that I've, read out there, is very few um like pre-service special education programs have a standalone transition course. So like a lot of them is like this transition knowledge is embedded. So there might be like an assessment course, and like part of the objectives is looking at transition assessments, let's say. But okay, so if we don't have a standalone course and it's embedded, that's kind of hard to measure like what instructors are teaching it, how to much extent or what have you. When I actually first got to Purdue, and this is kind of across the board, so it's not like just a Purdue thing, but I was asked to guest lecture in one of our assessment courses on transition assessment. And I had students come up to me afterwards saying, hey, I'm going to teach this population, middle school, high school. What other classes can I take to learn more about this to support them? And I still was new to the system. I didn't know all the classes that we offered yet, but we don't offer a standalone transition course. So like, I was like, that's all the education that you get, which isn't great. So I think like those who are working with that population, like if we better equipped them with being able to support parents to be involved, I think that would be, helpful. They're also the, potential individuals that are going into the community to set, work experiences for their students to engage in throughout the, school year. So work-based learning experiences have shown, really positive influences, but, teachers mostly are going to have to go into the community and be like, hey, Goodwill, hypothetically, like, could we work with you, volunteer a couple hours a day, so on and so forth. But again, if we don't prepare them to be able to make those relationships, there's a breakdown. And then I also see it from an early childhood standpoint, because I get so much either student wise that I'm teaching or, professionals that, well, that's not what I do. Like I'm early childhood, that's transition stuff. But I would argue that it should start in that early age. Like we can work on skills that allow them to be more independent when they get older. And so I think if we have that mentality that like, oh, well, that's not what I do, then it's going to be even harder to get people invested. I don't know if I fully kind of answered that. I went all over the place with that one.
I think covered quite a bit. What do you think for like that higher level stakeholders, those in control over the policies rather than those actually doing it, or even at the legislative level? Is there enough data to show outcomes for the assessments that are out there to then show one that's more personalized or a new approach? Could you even have the comparative data, I guess is what I'm saying? Or is it kind of just you're gonna have to show this is effective and hopefully the others are too, but try ours instead? Where do you get that information to even get some of that policy change?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I actually, so last summer, the Special Education Leadership Institute, they do it every summer, and it's people from across all the states coming, and we're going on to Capitol Hill to, meet with our reps to talk about these issues, and they set the agenda for us, like we're going to talk about funding for mental health or, teacher shortage, what have you, and so, I when I went to that, I tried to tie in this like transition piece and like this is why we should be investing in it because those numbers do matter to those policymakers because if they're seeing all of their constituents are impacted by this, there's a large amount of people that might not transition to employment, and so that's going to put a lot of pressure on that state and how we're supporting those individuals, trying to get them more invested by showing that data. But I a lot of my work is actually is melded, single case in ABA. It's kind of, synonymous in a way. But when I went through my program, I became more of a qualitative researcher because I wanted to understand people's perspectives and stories. And I found doing that too and sharing those perspectives with these legislators was actually very impactful because they could hear from people with disabilities saying that they're not ready or their families are kind of scared or what have you, or like community members. And I think there's a uh, room for both, but there's also a lack of data within the assessment piece. I think it's hard to sell just like we should be focusing on just the assessment. It's almost like we have to encompass it all together. But I feel like I have kind of found a gap almost in some of the research of we have these employment outcomes, we have best practices educationally, but like there's not as much about like our understanding of like how these assessments are provided. So we don't have the large amounts of data. We have some qualitative, but I that's kind of an area I want to focus on because I feel like if we had those numbers, maybe that would also make a difference. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think you still have to find a way to make it salient and obvious to them as well, because all you have to do is look at the follow through project for those that aren't familiar, and where they did that longitudinal study. I think it lasted close to 30 years. The U.S. government testing the most effective teaching techniques, and they have this data and then do nothing with it and go through all the fad teaching approaches instead. And so
Mm-hmm.
some way of making it obvious to them, nope, this is actually the way to go. But that data is going to be key because they're going to take 5 minutes to look at something. Oh, that graph is much better, and then move on. So
Mm-hmm.
Well, and
Mm-hmm.
part of that too, the assessment can, we can, and tell me if I'm wrong, we can narrow down really well, maybe what some strengths and needs are, but then there's the whole skill development part too. And that's a whole other thing, I feel like, like
Yeah.
teaching some of these skills, like, identifying them is one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to teach them and teach them effectively would be another part of it.
I didn't mention this, and I think it's important that I think a lot of people when they provide these assessments, they all focus on kind of, what are your preferences? Like, what are your likes and dislikes? Which is helpful, but almost, that checks the box. But like, there's so
Mhm.
much else, like you said, skills that we need to, what are the skills that we need to prepare them for, what have you? And I do a lot of work with, more extensive support needs. And we have a limited amount of assessments that are even available to be chosen from on that kind of side too. So I feel like I just keep saying there's more and more problems.
We're good at pointing out the problems. What role do you see behavior analysts like playing in, remedying some of these barriers in the system?
Yeah, I mean, I see that we need more collaboration, and this, could just be my personal experience of like coming from a rehab and ABA background of like, I really see the importance of data and how to like implement it and how to inform our practice and how we kind of do some of that skill development. And so like how can we bridge this gap of BCBAs and SPED teachers working together? Because I think there's a lot of maybe butting heads due to certain perceptions of the field or what have you. It actually that's what drew me to Purdue was their ABA program was underneath their SPED program. And so we kind of have a pathway to support our undergrads if they want to go and then get their BCBA and have a teacher's license. And so I think more of that would be cool, or just like teaching about collaboration more, especially now with the new accreditation for ABA of like it has to be a standalone master's course.
Mm,
I almost worry if that's going to make more of like a divide. I think it's important to do that, but like we also need to then say, okay, we should be collaborating more because there are a lot of great skills that BCBAs have and different knowledge that they can then apply to help these educators. Like, is there an extra good assessment they could do, or could they interpret some of the data, see things differently in that light?
Yeah, I know at Western Michigan it was real cool. I don't think there was any, or maybe there was a dual pathway, but the behavior analysis professors would actually go over to the special education department and teach some classes and train some, and so they had some of that skill, maybe partially for skill acquisition, but I think a lot of it was also dealing with um, troublesome behavior as well and how to navigate that. But that is definitely something I think it certainly can't hurt to give some of those skills, even if it's not a, dual certificate, that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, and like you said too, with the behavior, this just reminds me of some interviews I did from a previous study where, you know, I think it was a special ed teacher who had her BCBA or she was going to get her BCBA, and so she chose assessments that would look at kind of those behavioral aspects of like how do we support that too, because that might be impeding transitioning out of high school and what have you. But she kind of had that knowledge and background. Others who don't, then that also might be a challenge too, like we need to address this, and that's maybe impacting what that transition is going to look like. So yeah, I think that collaboration, there's so many people that help these families and individuals, like we should all be
yeah.
talking together and working together.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Speaking to your point earlier, finishing up, this is my BCABA that I completed. I felt ready to go and walked into a school setting because once you get those letters, a lot of organizations are just like, yeah, you're good, just you go figure it out, and just like the school
Mhm.
world is a completely different world. I was not ready for everything, all the different rules, all the different ways, even being allowed to I'll just go to the classroom. Like, yeah, you're not allowed in the
Mhm.
classroom. Like, wait, what?
Right.
How am I going to observe behavior? So there's a lot of
Mhm.
through the years of owing it to the people I work with to learn that system and to be part of that
Mhm.
world. Then, like you said,
Mhm.
collaborate with those folks because they're
Mhm.
under their own contingencies, their own constraints too.
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely, yeah, a whole other beast than kind of, staying in the clinic world. And I tried to, when I was in my clinic before I went to get my doctorate, I tried to bridge a lot of those gaps with like the schools too, because it is so different. And like, if that's the ultimate goal to get these students in with everybody else in like society, like then we should be helping to bridge that and make things more realistic.
What would you say are some of the most important skills, and maybe not even solely like vocationally based, but just for we know there's a services gap after 18 or 21, whenever that is, depending on the state that you're in. We know that supports become either more difficult or less than what you can get, especially as somebody with certain diagnoses before. um, what are those skills now that you see with young children in particular that are going to be most crucial for developing those necessary skills for later in life?
Mm.
I don't know if that question makes sense, but what's
Yeah.
what's most important to be teaching now when it comes to transitioning into the workforce and adulthood later on?
Yeah, and I'm going to take this in two different directions. The first is the kind of specific skills to support students with. Mm, I think it's from a very early age too, like how can we work on some more of these like self-advocacy or determination skills that will lead to these kind of other behaviors. So like if an individual is not able to know what they're good and they're not good at, what they need support in, like how are we expecting them then when they are at work and they're asking for accommodations to even ask for those? Like we can't. That's not their fault. They were just never taught how to do that. And so I think a lot of times, to no fault of other people's, but like professionals be almost like do the advocating for, families do the advocating for, or like, we're bridging this gap for services and stuff. And then we're kind of creating this like learned helplessness within the individual. And so I think I always go back to there of like, how can we instill a lot of these like self-determined behaviors or like advocacy behaviors that are going to benefit you later on. Because yeah, the services stop, well, different services you get when you're into adulthood, but if you're going into post-secondary education, you don't have an IEP anymore.
Right.
And so like I have so many students in my classes that they did have IEPs potentially in high school, and so now they're having to advocate for their own supports and like also learn to be an adult in the same time, and there's other things they have to worry, like that's just a lot. And so I personally think if we started there, especially early on, then some of the more specific like vocational skills or stuff like that, like we can teach that. I don't think that is a huge battle. But the other way that I was going to go with this question was I almost see things as we can teach people to do really whatever. Like we can teach them to do the skills of the job, what have you. But like if we have employers or like other society members, communities that like perceive those with disabilities as like less than, or like, oh, well, they can't have these jobs, then that is the biggest problem. If we don't address that piece, we can teach the skills to nausea, but like they're never going to be able to apply them then because we
Yeah.
just have all this like, oh well, no, not here. So
Yeah.
again, I don't think things happen in a vacuum. We have to do both at the same time.
You're getting lots of clap emojis from Cora in the chat there. So well put. um, you mentioned self-determination a couple times. I kind of skipped over that earlier. I hear that word a lot. I think sometimes it means different things to different people. In the context of the IEP and transition assessments, what is self-determination, and do you see it being implemented the way that it's kind of intended to be implemented? Or and this is kind of going back to the caregiver input too. um but yeah, I don't know what your thoughts on self-determination are.
Yeah, self-determination, like very broadly, I mean, for a lack of better ways to explain it, like we have the ownership of our own lives to like make our own decisions. Like we direct the goals that we want, and of course, things are influenced by like external variables. But to do that, we need to teach people, to know about themselves, of like how to tell other people their needs and wants. That to support students from an early age that like, hey, you have autonomy over your own body. Maybe that's like through consent like practices or assent and like things of that nature. And so there there's a lot of self-determination as a whole has a lot of research backed behind it of saying that it is a positive predictor to a lot of different areas of life,
Mhm.
especially work, what have you. And so I think we are doing a good job at that. I think maybe we could do better. Like I see a lot of research that shows some positive impacts, but I don't know how much in practice it's being um, implemented as much. Is that a higher ed thing where I should be including in all my classes to teach them how to do it? I mean, yes, for sure.
Yeah.
But I think it's also complicated. Like, I keep going back. If we wait until someone's 16 to start teaching them about themselves, that's a little, I'm like, okay, well, we can still teach it, but like that's a large learning history that we're trying to like we're coming up against.
Sure.
And so, looking at those aspects of self-determination and advocacy from a very early age of yeah, what are your likes and dislikes, what are your accommodations that you need, everybody needs support in some sort of fashion. And then how can we scaffold on top of that as like they're getting older. um I just lost my train of thought.
It,
Where I was
No,
going with
that,
that.
yeah.
you can see how it fits in, like when we're working in the adult population, and again, a lot of it has to do
I
with
was gonna
who
say
we are working with.
PCP,
Yeah,
person-centered
person-centered plan,
planning.
but there's also self-determination, at least in the state of Michigan, where
Yeah.
you can get funding to get the supports you want rather than the ones that they would prefer to. I say prefer, probably that make more sense because they can put you on a special waiver and get extra funding and that sort of thing. And so there's that process seems different, but I think really falls in line if you look at the meaning behind it, how it should work versus how it's kind of just an alleyway to get you that, care or coverage. Because looking at it, like when we go in for a behavior plan, historically, before us behavior analysts were doing them, at least in the state of Michigan, it was how do we get someone to write in a restriction so the house can just try to keep someone safe and make it run easier. And we're like, no, we're actually trying to work on skill building here, even if it is due to some aberrant behavior. And so you tell us what your goals are. And now this is a roadmap to reach your goals, not just to, hey, fall in line and be good. And if we reframe that, I think to society as a whole, that it shouldn't just be fall in line so nobody recognizes that you're different or that, that you may have some struggles here and there, but more as we're going to design this roadmap to get you to be wherever you want to be. I think if you take that framework to it, and I think that's the way it should be, or it was probably meant to be in the first place, it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, and it makes me think my dissertation was all about self-determination related to work specifically. And so I taught high school students, you know, to come up and write their own goals of what they wanted to do for work. That could be included in their IEP because there's a lot of work to like self-directed IEPs, like we should involving these students from an early age. And I always come back to this because I'm like, I'm sure it's not only this, group of 4 students that I worked with, but they were all between the ages of like 16 and 22. And a majority of them, when, initially I was like, hey, like, what is a goal? Oh, no idea. Like, what even that concept is. Like, how do I create that? And I'm like, oh my gosh, you're about to graduate. If you don't, again, if you don't know what your own goals are, then what's being written in these plans that are supporting you? Like, is it even what you want to do at the end of the day?
Yeah.
And so hearing
Yeah.
you talk just made me think of that.
A lot of times in those meetings, it is, what do you want to do? Like, well, I want to go to McDonald's. Like, that's great, but like, how about where do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you actually want to live? This is a fairly restrictive setting because of some of the issues that have been going on. We want to get you elsewhere, but where is that? What are we working towards? Because nobody probably ever stated it that way for them. They're saying like,
Right.
what do I want to do today? Whereas if the way you're talking about it, had that been discussed earlier, they could actually have a plan coming into these meetings of where they want to be someday.
Yeah, right. Like not knowing how to set a goal or to do that isn't because they have a disability. It's because they haven't been educated and supported. So like again, it comes back to like it's our fault at the end of the day. This kind of systems top down approach.
Yeah. Well, and even our folks with, more significant, like not as robust verbal repertoires or, an inability to speak on their own behalf, a lot of times those meetings, they're kind of fast meetings and a lot of goals get determined for that person without a lot of discussion about like, how does this guy really communicate his assent to something? We should be able to at least have some sort of process in which we can gauge whether this person wants to do the things that we are suggesting, and we put in a plan that's going to be kind of the roadmap for the next year, until the next planning meetings.
Yeah.
And even in the most extreme cases where there's a court order and they're told that you have to do what these professionals say, even then it should still be based on what those goals are and how we can help you reach them. You may not have autonomy in the fact that you need to work towards some goals because there's a court order in place, but we're still working towards your goals.
Right.
Ricky, as we wind down on time, are there any research questions or anything in this area that you are really, really curious about answering, looking into, working on, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the assessment piece I'm trying to do, I'm actually working on a project right now to compile like all of the available work-based assessments that like are for this population, because again, I think it comes down to if we're not providing the resources to find things, like there's a breakdown. So I'm focusing on that, but I'm really interested in now this kind of higher ed. How are we supporting professionals to know how to support this transition? And yeah, like doing work of that nature. And something I'm trying to do more of is doing this work with either practitioners or with individuals with disabilities. And I find that is, really enhancing my work because I don't have those experiences. And like, we a lot of times in academia we don't uplift those voices and experiences of especially those with disabilities. And so bringing them onto like my projects, they have different perspectives. It's like, oh hey, I wouldn't have thought of things that way. Like, yeah, let's do this research together. Like you are going to be the researcher with me, and kind of directing things that way. So trying to do this work but then bringing in those perspectives.
Awesome. I support it. I love that. It's really great. Anything before we wind down? Any other questions from the crowd? Steve, any other questions come to mind?
No, I've been throwing them out there rapid fire as I come up.
Cora says no, so she's been our big audience participant today. Ricky, thanks so much for joining us. This is really enlightening. Dr. Ricky Price is an assistant professor of special education at Purdue University. Thank you again for joining Cooperant Learning.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is great.